In 1892, a cartographer's assistant in London made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While cataloguing centuries-old maps for the Royal Geographical Society's archive expansion, he found something that shouldn't exist. A portfolio of maps, pristine and detailed, showing a vast territory labelled Tartaria that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The maps themselves weren't unusual. Tartary had appeared on European maps for centuries. What made his hands tremble was the notation on one particular document. Updated 1890. Revised boundaries confirmed by survey expedition. Someone had surveyed Tartaria in 1890. Decades after every official record claimed the name had been abandoned, replaced by proper designations like Mongolia, Turkestan, Manchuria. Decades after the territory supposedly ceased to exist as a recognizable entity. The assistant wrote a careful memo to his supervisor asking about the provenance of these maps. He never received an answer. The portfolio disappeared from the catalogue 3 weeks later. No record of its removal, no explanation. Just gone. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, similar maps kept surfacing in unexpected places. Estate sales in Paris, university archives in Berlin, private collections in St. Petersburg, all showing Tartaria not as a vague historical reference but as a contemporary political reality. Maps with details that should have been impossible. Infrastructure networks, railway lines, administrative divisions, the kind of information that comes from direct observation and not ancient texts or faded memory. Abraham Ortelius published his famous World Atlas in 1570, and yes, it included Tartaria, a massive territory representing what he understood to be the Mongol Empire's extent, even though that empire had fragmented 2 centuries earlier. By the 1700s, cartographers like Guillaume de Lisle were dividing the region into more specific areas: Western Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. Each designation reflecting European attempts to categorize a vast, poorly understood landscape. Standard history tells us the name faded naturally. As Russian and Chinese empires expanded their control as European knowledge improved, the blanket term Tartary became obsolete, replaced by accurate geographical and political names: Turkestan for the western regions, Mongolia for the central steppes, Manchuria for the east. A simple story of cartographic evolution, knowledge replacing ignorance. Except the maps from the 1890s don't tell that story. They show something else entirely. A territory that was still being surveyed, still being mapped with contemporary precision, still treated as a distinct entity worthy of detailed documentation, not a historical curiosity, a present reality. Consider what updating a map in 1890 actually meant. This was the age of systematic geographical surveys, trained expeditions using theodolites, measuring chains, astronomical observations. You couldn't just sketch approximations anymore. Map-making had become a science, demanding verifiable data. When someone marked a map as updated in 1890, they were claiming recent, direct observation of the territory. They were saying someone went there, measured it, documented it, and returned with information precise enough to warrant a revised edition. Who were these surveyors? Where are their expedition reports? If Tartaria was simply an outdated name for well-known regions, why would anyone bother surveying it as a unified territory in the final decade of the 19th century? The 1824 maps show something fascinating. Chinese Tartaria and China appearing as separate entities, side by side, not as historical layers but as contemporary political divisions. By 1850, the maps begin shifting. Mongolia starts appearing where independent Tartary used to be. China expands dramatically, absorbing territories. Tartaria begins its disappearance. By 1885, Central Asian maps show Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria. The name Tartary is gone, the standard narrative complete. But those 1890s maps, the ones that kept appearing in archives and collections, they don't fit this timeline. They show Tartaria persisting past its supposed extinction date. They suggest the name didn't fade naturally, but was actively replaced, deliberately removed, systematically erased from cartographic record, even while the territory itself remained distinct enough to warrant continued surveying. The French cartographer Guillaume de Lisle achieved his position as premier géographe du roi through something specific: the veracity of his sources. His reputation rested on using reports from actual explorers and travellers, not recycling old information or inventing details. When de Lisle drew Tartary on his maps, covering Scandinavia to the Ural Mountains and deep into Asia, he was working from contemporary accounts. People who had been there, people who had seen it, people who described it as a real, observable place. That tradition continued into the 1800s. Cartographers didn't just copy previous maps, they updated them based on new expeditions, new reports, new surveys. The appearance of updated Tartaria maps in the 1890s suggests those expeditions continued far longer than official history acknowledges. What happens when you find evidence that contradicts the accepted timeline? When physical documents show a territory existing decades after it supposedly vanished, you're left with two possibilities. Either the maps are fraudulent, elaborate hoaxes created for unknown purposes, or the historical narrative is incomplete, sanitized, deliberately simplified to hide something more complex, something that continued happening while the official story declared it finished. The cataloger's assistant in London wasn't the only one who noticed these anomalies. Others found similar contradictions, and like him, they learned that asking questions about Tartaria's persistence led nowhere. Files went missing, collections were reorganized, maps were reclassified or simply disappeared. Not through dramatic seizures or obvious censorship, through quiet administrative actions that left no trail, which raises the question nobody wanted to ask. If Tartaria was just a geographical term, a cartographic convenience, why did its evidence need to be managed so carefully? The architecture provides a different kind of evidence. Walk through any major city built between 1850 and 1920, and you'll notice something peculiar about the construction. Buildings that official records claim were erected in mere months display stonework requiring decades of skilled labour. Structures supposedly built by frontier towns with populations under 10,000 feature engineering complexity that shouldn't exist outside major European capitals. Courthouses in rural America with marble staircases, hand-carved columns, and domed ceilings that rival Renaissance cathedrals. All constructed during periods when those towns barely had paved roads. The scale doesn't match the resources. The timelines don't align with the technology. The craftsmanship exceeds what the documented workforce could produce. Yet there they stand, solid and undeniable, with plaques declaring construction dates that make no practical sense. Then there's the consistency. Travel from San Francisco to St. Petersburg, from Buenos Aires to Melbourne, and you'll find the same architectural language, the same proportions, the same techniques, the same aesthetic principles appearing simultaneously across continents that supposedly had minimal contact. Buildings erected within the same narrow window, all displaying mastery that official history claims developed independently in dozens of locations at once. Standard explanations point to shared European influences, international architectural movements, the spread of neoclassical design. But influence doesn't explain execution. You can admire Roman architecture without possessing the engineering knowledge to replicate it. You can study Gothic cathedrals without understanding the mathematics that keep them standing. Yet somehow, across the world, builders suddenly possessed not just the inspiration but the precise technical capability to create structures of extraordinary sophistication. Many of these buildings share another feature: basement levels and lower floors that sit far below current street level. Not slightly below, dramatically below. In some cases, entire first floors now function as basements, with original entryways buried 10 or 15 feet underground. The standard explanation involves gradual urban development, streets raised over time to improve drainage and accommodate modern infrastructure. But the depth is too uniform, the burial too complete, and crucially, the original proportions remain intact. These buildings weren't designed for their current relationship with ground level. They were built for a different surface, a different context, a different street plan that no longer exists in any official record. Photographs from the late 1800s show something interesting. Many major cities display evidence of recent excavation, not archaeological digs. Large-scale earth-moving operations, entire districts with exposed foundations, streets being raised, buildings emerging from layers of filled dirt. The official story describes urban renewal, infrastructure improvement, modernization efforts, all perfectly reasonable explanations, except the timing clusters suspiciously around the same period. Tartaria vanishes from maps, the same decades when architectural styles suddenly standardize across continents. The same years when population records begin showing dramatic increases that strain credibility given previous census data. Cities that supposedly grew from frontier outposts to metropolitan centres in single generations, complete with infrastructure that should require centuries to develop. Consider the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Official records claim the entire complex, covering over 600 acres with more than 200 buildings, was constructed in just over 2 years. Temporary structures, we're told, built from plaster and wood, designed for quick assembly and demolition. Yet photographs show buildings of extraordinary detail. Classical facades, intricate sculptures, massive domed halls. The kind of construction that even with modern equipment and materials would require years of planning and execution. The exposition buildings were demolished shortly after the fair ended. Almost all of them. Torn down, removed, erased. The official reason? They were always meant to be temporary. But temporary structures don't require the level of engineering visible in the photographs. Temporary buildings don't need foundations that deep or frameworks that robust. Unless they weren't temporary, unless they were something else being repurposed, displayed briefly, then removed before too many questions could be asked. This pattern repeats across world fairs and expositions of that era. Massive architectural complexes appearing with suspicious speed, standing briefly, then vanishing completely. Always with the same explanation. Always temporary, always demolished, never preserved despite their obvious cultural and artistic value. Almost as if the goal wasn't to create something new but to display something old, then ensure it couldn't be studied too closely. The photographic record from these expositions reveals another anomaly. The buildings don't look new. Even in images taken during construction, the structures display a weathered quality, a patina suggesting age beyond their supposed months of existence. Stone that appears worn, metalwork showing oxidation, architectural details with the kind of settling and subtle degradation that only occurs over decades. Modern restoration experts examining these photographs note something else. The construction techniques visible in the images don't match the temporary building methods of the 1890s. The joinery is too sophisticated, the material choices too permanent, the structural systems too overbuilt for structures meant to last a single season. They look less like temporary fair buildings and more like permanent architecture being temporarily displayed. Which brings us back to the maps. To the surveys continuing into the 1890s, to the architectural explosion happening simultaneously, to the systematic renaming and reorganisation of territories, all occurring in the same compressed time frame, all leaving behind evidence that doesn't quite fit the official narrative. Evidence suggesting something larger was happening. Something that required careful management, something that needed to be explained away, categorized properly, and ultimately forgotten. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The maps prove it appeared in cartographic records for centuries. The question is what it actually was. Whether it represented a unified empire, a collection of territories, or simply European ignorance about a vast region they barely understood. What we can say with certainty is this. The term appeared consistently on official maps created by respected cartographers for over 3 centuries. Abraham Ortelius included it in his 1570 atlas. Guillaume de Lisle, premier geographer to the French king, mapped multiple distinct Tartaries in the 1700s. British cartographers showed Western Tartary and Chinese Tartary as separate regions well into the 1800s. These weren't fringe documents. They were authoritative references used by governments, militaries, and educational institutions across Europe. Then something shifted. By 1850, the subdivisions began collapsing. Independent Tartary became Turkestan. Chinese Tartary transformed into Mongolia and Manchuria. Russian Tartary was absorbed into Siberia. The Crimean Khanate, once Little Tartary, was simply Crimea. Within a single generation, a geographical designation that had persisted for centuries was methodically replaced, territory by territory, until nothing remained. The standard explanation frames this as cartographic progress. As European powers expanded their direct knowledge of Central Asia through exploration and colonization, vague blanket terms were naturally replaced with specific regional names. More accurate information led to more precise maps, simple evolution of understanding. But that explanation struggles with one detail: the architecture. Because while the maps were being redrawn, while territories were being renamed and reorganized, the buildings remained. Structures of extraordinary scale and sophistication scattered across the exact regions formerly labelled Tartary. Government buildings with doorways reaching 12 to 15 feet. Administrative complexes featuring stonework precision that challenges modern replication. Infrastructure suggesting organizational capacity far beyond scattered nomadic groups or newly conquered territories. These buildings exist. You can visit them. They're documented in photographs from the late 1800s, many showing structures already ancient when the cameras arrived. Yet their construction histories remain curiously vague. Built by local craftsmen, we're told. Constructed during various imperial expansions. Dates estimated rather than documented. Architectural techniques unexplained. The disconnect becomes obvious when you compare the buildings to the people supposedly responsible for them. Nomadic groups credited with erecting permanent stone complexes, requiring advanced mathematics and engineering. Recently conquered populations supposedly capable of construction projects that would challenge modern contractors. Territories described as undeveloped wilderness, somehow containing infrastructure rivaling European capitals. Something doesn't align. Either the architectural evidence is being misattributed, or the historical narrative about these regions is incomplete. Then there are those World's Fairs, the expositions appearing with impossible speed in the 1890s and early 1900s. Massive complexes covering hundreds of acres, featuring buildings of classical design and intricate detail, supposedly constructed in months, then demolished almost immediately after closing. The official records are meticulous about certain details: attendance figures, revenue, featured exhibits. But the construction logistics remain oddly vague. How many workers? What were the actual material costs? Where did the architectural plans originate? These questions receive generic answers, or none at all. What we have instead are photographs. Images showing structures that don't look temporary. Stone facades that appear aged. Metalwork displaying oxidation patterns requiring years to develop. Construction techniques more permanent than seasonal. Buildings that, according to restoration experts examining the archival images, were built to last centuries, not months. The demolition happened quickly, almost urgently. Structures that supposedly took years to plan and build were torn down in weeks. Very little was preserved. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 left behind almost nothing, despite covering over 600 acres with more than 200 buildings. Gone. Removed. Erased before proper documentation could occur. This pattern repeats across multiple expositions in that era, grand architectural displays appearing suddenly, standing briefly, vanishing completely. Always the same justification, always temporary, always demolished, never adequately explained. So what actually happened during those decades when Tartaria disappeared from maps? When territories were systematically renamed and reorganized? When architectural styles suddenly standardized across continents? When population records showed dramatic increases, straining credibility? When massive exposition buildings appeared and vanished with suspicious coordination? The conventional answer is progress, improved cartography, colonial expansion, industrial revolution, modernization, all reasonable explanations supported by documented historical events. But the evidence keeps pointing elsewhere, to architectural anomalies without adequate construction histories, to geographical designations erased with unusual thoroughness, to exposition buildings demolished despite obvious permanence, to systematic reorganization happening simultaneously across multiple continents, to patterns suggesting something larger was being managed, explained and ultimately obscured. The maps tell us Tartary existed for centuries as a recognized geographical designation. The buildings tell us someone constructed infrastructure of remarkable sophistication across those exact regions. The photographs tell us structures of apparent age and permanence were displayed then destroyed in the late 1800s. The records tell us this all happened during a compressed time frame of territorial reorganization and cartographic revision. What they don't tell us is why. Why the urgency? Why the coordination? Why the systematic erasure of a term that had served cartographers for 300 years? Why the demolition of buildings that could have stood for generations? Those questions remain unanswered, not because evidence doesn't exist, but because asking them has become uncomfortable, because the answers might require reconsidering assumptions about recent history, about who built what, about what came before, about what we've inherited, without fully understanding its origins. The maps were redrawn, the buildings remain, and somewhere between those two facts lies a story we've chosen not to examine too closely. The cataloguer's assistant in London never spoke publicly about what he found. The portfolio that vanished from the Royal Geographical Society's archives was never mentioned in official records. No investigation, no inquiry, just silence. But he kept his memo, the one asking about maps showing Tartaria surveyed in 1890. It stayed in his personal papers until his death in 1934. His family found it decades later, filed among letters and household documents. A single page asking questions nobody wanted answered. The maps are still out there, scattered across private collections, misfiled in university archives, tucked away in estate sale boxes. Updated editions from the 1890s showing territories that officially ceased to exist decades earlier. Architectural photographs displaying buildings too sophisticated for their supposed origins. Exposition records describing construction timelines that don't align with visible evidence. Census data showing population explosions without adequate explanation. Infrastructure appearing in places that shouldn't possess it. All of it documented. All of it preserved. All of it quietly ignored because examining it too closely means questioning everything we think we know about the late 19th century. About who built our cities, about what existed before the maps were redrawn, about what was deliberately forgotten when the name Tartaria was systematically erased from cartographic record. The buildings remember what the history books chose to forget. The question is whether we're ready to ask why they needed to forget it in the first place.